Chapter 12, Culture. Culture is a context. So you look at collective of values and beliefs and norms. Culture can be subtle. Aspects, ethical and unethical considerations. Culture allows interpreting information, implications, not understanding context. So when you look at culture, you're talking about a collective of values, beliefs, and norms. This is what makes us who we are. So when everybody comes to the table, they bring their culture. And this is what I tell folks, you can't undo who you are and what you believe. And the things that you are, your upbringing, everything you've been through from the time your parents started indoctrinating you got indoctrinated to your family and community, education system, the works. This makes you who you are. Culture can be subtle. So when you look at culture can be subtle and stuff. And sometimes people don't take that in consideration because it can be something that it can be unspoken. It could be something just not people talk about. It could just be something that people do and what they believe. Therefore, you don't see it. Affects ethical and unethical considerations. So when you look at the effects of ethical and unethical situations, when trying to negotiate for the price of a rug in a bazaar or marketplace, the initial price asked for you by the seller is usually like going to be many times greater than what the actual price will be. So when you look at that, you're going to find somebody who's going to look at it and try to determine whether or not you're doing something ethical or unethical. It's one thing to try to make a profit. It's another thing to be unethical. Culture allows interpreting information. So culture allows interpreting information, and because people have different cultures and stuff, they may interpret information differently. And this could be an issue when you're negotiating with somebody because you may not understand how they see things. Implications not understanding context. Context is something that's very important. So when your implications not understanding context, and you're likely to miss important information or misunderstand or misinterpret something, which could cause you to draw a wrong conclusion and sabotage what it is you're trying to do. Defining culture. So character of a social group. So when you look at the character of a social group, you're gonna see a couple of things. Characteristics, values, espoused, the communication and shared by members of the group, the social, legal, economic rules and institutions that govern the group. And let me see. And just in things in general, like, even to include like art, literature, music, theater, the things that they listen to. So operates by interpretation, information. So when you think of that, this is what culture operate by interpreting culture and information. You're going to interpret things a certain way. You're going to see certain things a certain way because of your culture. And when you have that, then you're going to draw a conclusion, and that will be processed as the information. Now, whether you got that right or wrong, that's something to be seen later. So culture is a rule book. So when you look at culture as a rule book, this is kind of what everybody, in a specific culture, it's kind of things that are kind of unwritten, accepted, but everybody kind of abides by and operates with something within the culture. Therefore, you don't get culture shock because you did something that everybody else would say, oh my God, why would you do something like that? It may be fine in a culture, maybe a different culture that you came from, but you went to a culture where it was totally unacceptable. Conceptualizing culture as an iceberg. So when you conceptualize culture as an iceberg, you think of an iceberg, you see the tip of it. So you see certain things with your eyes and you could observe. But just like an iceberg, only the tip is usually above the water. All the rest is below the water. So then there's all these other things that you don't know about and you don't pick up on, you may not understand. Defining culture. So outsider may never fully understand. So when you're outsider and you come into a situation, so being an effective foreigner. So being an effective foreigner, when you think of being an effective foreigner, never try to be something that you're not. Just be understand where you are and understand this. Probably times you're gonna have to do some observing, ask a lot of questions so that you can make sure that you understand what it is you don't know, and don't make assumptions. That old expression, when in Rome, do as in Rome. Cultural context is specific. So we look at cultural context. Cultural context is, it's highly unlikely that like an outsider negotiating with a A native negotiator would even be aware of specific strategy. So if you negotiate with somebody and you're not aware of certain things with their culture, well, you wouldn't know their culture, their background, all this other stuff. So cultural context is going to be specific. So try to do your best to get edified and know what you talk as much as you can about the culture with somebody before you go into negotiations. Negotiation attempt as an outsider. Here again, this is making sure that you understand you are an outsider, and don't try to act like you're not. You are an outsider, and try to understand as much as you can about where you are and what you negotiate on, and don't let cultural pitfalls be your downfall. So here, when we look at this, you see the culture as an iceberg, as I described it earlier. See, these are the things when I said you see the tip of the iceberg. You can see the dress, language, customs, celebrations, holidays, rules. That's above surface. But look what's below. Beliefs, unacceptable body language, expectations, unwritten rules, assumptions, cultural values, importance of space. These are the kind of things, if somebody's going to get in trouble, negotiate with somebody who has a different culture, it's not going to be that top 10%. It's going to be that 90% below the surface that you don't see. So dimensions of culture. So idiosyncratic cultural characteristics. So, while fascinating and it illustrates an important point, they have less relevant than powerful and systematic differences that have been observed in cultures. Behavioral differences among cultures. So, these differences in behaviors are, they're driven by cultural factors under the surface or the cultural subcultures and things along those lines. Underlying invisible factors. We just from the illustration that we just showed, those are the things out there you can take a look at to see. That will be underlying and invisible. Global dimensions of culture. So global dimensions of culture, let's see, original work, I'll read this way. Original work by that was done in 1980 and 1990s has expanded by Global Leadership Organization, Global Effectiveness Research Project, and more. So they've done a lot of research globally about this because we're a global society now. And more so than any time in our history, you got to learn how to deal with other cultures. Performance orientation. So when we think about this, this is a culture that encourages and rewards individuals, for performance improvement and excellence. Future orientation. This is when individuals engage in a future-oriented behavior such as delaying gratification, planning, or investing in the future. Cultures that score high on these are likely to have higher rates of household savings and investments, as well as focus on education. Assertiveness. The degree to which individuals are assertive. They're confrontational, maybe aggressive in their relationships with others, and that's all subjective, really. Collectivism, this is going to be the degree in which individuals express pride, loyalty, and cohesiveness in their organization or in their families. Strong collective group of people, group, or whatever it may be. Gender egalitarianism. So when we look at this is going to be the degree that the culture diminishes gender inequity. So it's where you try to take gender out of it. The goal is to coaches to minimize that. Try to get males and females on an equal playing field. Power distance. The extent is accepted in a society where the power is distributed unequally. So what's the power distance between those who have it at the top and those who don't have it at the bottom? Uncertainty avoidance. So you see the level of tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity within a society. Some societies are going to have a higher tolerance for that, and some of them will not. The higher the score that someone is, the less the people in society are likely to tolerate uncertainty or ambiguity. So if you look at that, some are very tolerant and some would not be. Mean tendency in the society. So when we think about the mean tendency in society, we think about, let's see the best way to look at it, like I said, before looking into more detail at some of the differences between cultures, you should probably, it's important to remind ourselves that not to fall in the trap of stereotyping or out-group homogeneity, you know, cannot define by one characteristic. Some things, cultures, you cannot define it by one characteristic because it's multifaceted. So it has multiple things that comes into it to play. So you can't just pick out one, cherry pick. You got to take all things in consideration. So when we look at the dimensions of cultural differences, so cultural tables. So when we look at right here, we see cultural differences. And, this highlights, this graph right here highlights, some examples of actual observable behaviors and typical for negotiations from different cultures. So when you look at this, you see behavior, Japanese, silence. You see what it is. American, you see what that is. Brazilian, you see what that is. Conversational overlaps, talking while others are talking. You see Brazil, that's very high. What you see in Japan, that's very low. What might somebody in Japan think if they're negotiating with somebody from Brazil and they keep talking over? Probably think it's disrespectful. Staring. You can see Japan, they don't do a lot of eye contact. Americans give a little bit more, but Brazil gives a lot. Some people could view that as try to intimidate. And touching. You see, that's one of the things in Japan, they don't consider that something that doing negotiations, something you wouldn't do. Americans, for the most part, but Brazil are very touchy-feely. So this is something you would need to know if you imagine you're an American and you're negotiating, have situations with Japan and Brazil in similar cultures. This would be very important to know. Dimensions of culture. So globe scores in 4 different categories. So when we look at these globe scores, relative globe scores for Denmark. You see where the mean is. You see where they are for Nigeria. You see where they are for South Korea. And you see where they are for the United States. So you see that global mean is going to be a little bit, it's going to be where things might be a little bit more tolerant. You see they're going to be different for each location. This would be something for you to know about that global mean if you were actually talking with folks in these different places. Implications of cultural difference, collaborative approach. So a collaborative approach is, it's where you try to bring others in and you work together and get people to give input. Perception of negotiation purpose. So perception of negotiation purpose, is it acceptable to haggle? During the process, and you go purpose and stuff, how you go about doing it, perception of the negotiation purpose and stuff, like for instance, you may find in India, they may choose to, haggling is something that they consider part of the process. Whereas in America, we might view it as something that's not part of the process and considered to be unprofessional and antagonistic. Expectations about meeting purpose. You got to make sure you understand what the expectation about the meeting purpose is. Because if you have the wrong expectations or different expectations than someone else, you're asking yourself for something that's probably not going to go very well. Purpose misunderstanding. So when you look at purpose misunderstanding, don't misunderstand the purpose of what you're doing. If one negotiator believes that the first meeting is for getting to know each other and the other negotiator believes the first meeting is to start hammering out specifics, that's a purpose misunderstanding. Notion of timing of negotiation events. So when we think of notion of timing negotiation events, this is, when is it appropriate to talk about what end, what certain things and what can be expected and what time frame. When is it going to be appropriate in the process to discuss those kind of things. Expression of motion. So when you have expression of motion, expressions of emotion, you got to take it, would that be something that can be considered acceptable depending upon who you are negotiating with? For instance, some people may view you showing emotion as you being a little too aggressive, a little angry, a little hostile, whereas you may show it think as me being just passionate. So you got to take that consideration. Perceptions of power. So perceptions of power. When you go into, negotiations, you have to make sure that when you're actually going through, the perceptions of power are perceived properly. Meaning, if you're going through and you may be at an advantage by virtue of the topic and the situation that you're discussing, so you may be the person in possession of the power in this particular instance, not the other person. So You need to understand it. Or if you go in a position and you're actually, the power is primarily seated with the other party and not you, you need to know that as well too. Because, when you negotiate, you got to negotiate from the proper perspective, from your proper position. Meaning, if your position is the weaker one, you can't negotiate from a power perspective. So summaries, when you look at this and you bring this all together, when you look at these different cultures and doing negotiations and trying to deal with folks who are different than you, come from different places than you, have different ways of life or whatever, you have to do your due diligence and do your homework prior to having those meetings and those discussions. So, limiting perspective. One of the things you have to understand about limiting perspective, culture is not just about differences in nationalities, societies, and foreign locales and stuff. It's differences in people and things along those lines. Culture exists at many different levels. It may not always be salable or powerful, as they say, the differences between Danish negotiations and Nigerian negotiations, but it still can be very influential. Subcultures. We have subcultures. Subcultures can exist even if you're dealing with people in the United States. For instance, you have someone that's from the Northeast negotiate with somebody from the Southeast. And I give you an example of a subculture. They could actually have a Cajun subculture or a Creole subculture coming from the deep South in New Orleans, Louisiana. Organizational cultures affect negotiation. So when you have organizational cultures and stuff, a lot of times you find out is they have a philosophy and a way of thinking and doing things within that organization, and it becomes their culture. That affects how their negotiators negotiate, how they think and how they reason. Differentiations extend into the work teams. This also affects the work teams. What is always one of the things you always want to know is, what is the philosophy of this organization? What's their culture like? What's the philosophy? What's their outlook? How do they view things? Anticipate differences in strategy and tactics. You should always do that. For instance, need to do homework. Have I said this a couple of times on this presentation? You need to do your homework. If you go into negotiations and you have not done your due diligence, you are probably not going to do as well as you could have, or you may end up stumbling over one or two things because you got hit with some things that you weren't aware of and didn't know. You don't have time to do research and homework in the actual negotiation. Understand the culture iceberg. What is it that I'm seeing up here, above the surface? But what are the things below the surface I'm not seeing? Those, remember I said, those are the ones that trips people up. Make use of available information. Anything that you can get that's going to probably be beneficial. Even if you don't think it might be beneficial, get as much as you can for educational purposes before a negotiation, because you never know. There's no such thing as unuseful information when you're trying to do a negotiation. Leverage cultural differences to create value. So when you think about that, leverage cultural differences to create value. So we look at log roll. Log roll is like figure out which issues are more important to one party and trade those issues against the ones you care about the least. So if I've got something that I know that they want, but I don't care much about it, that's how I can play with it. That's a log roll. Beware of false consensus effect. When you think about that, you have some knowledge of a culture to anticipate possibility of creating value, but without knowledge of a culture, false consensus would lead to a difficult decision, hammered relationship, or potential stalemate because you're not sure exactly. You're not sure, but you got caught up in a situation where now you're be aware of a false consensus effect. When this happens, it's usually not good for one or the other party. We got a consensus, but it's not really based on the things that we need for. Avoid attributed errors. So perception of negotiation process. So, when it comes down to negotiating with people from a different culture, we, obviously going to be much more prone to making errors or attribution. Perception of behaviors. When you have a perception of what their behavior may be, but that's your perception. It may not be a reality. They may be behaving in a way that actually is actually positive or good in a way, but you view it as something else because you don't know you don't know their culture. Be aware of jumping to conclusions. Do not jump to conclusions. A lot of times I tell people you can't make good decisions based on partial information. And don't jump to conclusions, because a lot of times that means if you jump to a conclusion, that means you have skipped over some things you probably good for you to know. Avoid ethnocentrism. So this is essentially, the belief that one way of doing things is inherently correct. Since most of us, have grown up entirely within one culture, our perception is not only our way as being correct, but being normal. So because things are this way for me and my people, or me, the people who believe like me, or let's just say people who play sports and think like I do, then this is how I think it should be. Now that sports analogy is not based on ethnic reasoning, but you can be based on something very similar. So basically, it's folks, because I'm a guy who grew up a certain way, a certain race, and a certain culture, I believe everything is going to be the way I think they are. Not necessarily the case. Appropriate and inappropriate behavior. You got to know what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior. For instance, like we saw back in the slide earlier, is it okay to touch? Is it okay to give constant eye contact? You have to know those things. Displayed by the other negotiator. So understand when they're displaying this, if we negotiate with somebody from another culture, they're always going to have a tendency to think their culture perspective as being the right way versus ours being the wrong way. So you got to understand that. Show respect. This is something as a professional I would think you would want to do, but particularly during this process, people don't negotiate in a positive manner with folks they don't like or who come off as disrespectful. Avoid accidentally giving offense. Again, if you've done your homework, there are certain things that you want, customs and norms that you won't violate while you're actually in that negotiation. Give attention and treat seriously. You have to give attention and treat seriously. Showing respect to cultural practices is about giving those practices their due attention and treating them seriously. You have to. Behave and believe in conforming. Behaving, being conforming. Showing respect for a norm means not only behaving in a way that conforms to it, but also behaving as though you too believe that this is the way that people should behave. This is just how you do. Like I said, when in Rome. Be aware of exceptions and differences. So, being aware of exceptions and differences. Collectivism versus individualism. So when you got collectivism, it's very hard, it's very possible, you can go into to be a collectivist culture and still encounter individuals who are very focused on individual accomplishment, and are more ambitious and more driven towards the goal than the average person, in that society. So it's very possible. You could see that. You could see the collectivism as general, but you can see individualism underneath that or within that. True in organizations. So true in organization, just because an organization generally has a culture of innovation and exploration does not mean every person in that organization values innovation or thinks about the culture when they're making their day-to-day decisions. So sometimes you got to take consideration. You can have a great organization who has a great tradition, have great negotiations, and you can have a person who's negotiating for them not be all of that. Perceiving same reality differs. So when so when we think about that, is it is accepted and appropriate, in one society be considered highly inappropriate in the other. So making sure that you understand what's you're perceiving same reality, you got to understand. If they think something is offensive or whatever else, you need to understand that it is. If they think something's positive, you need to understand that it is. Bribery. Okay, bribery in most countries and stuff, that's actually illegal. So when you're thinking about doing things like that, at the end of the day, everybody knows what bribery is. I'm going to promise you something I shouldn't promise you to get you to do something I want you to do, or get you to give me something I should have. And that's usually setting yourself up for a serious pitfall. Probably not only getting yourself in trouble, probably getting terminated if things go south. Cultural value collision in business. So, when you're looking at cultural value, For, when you think about in trade and you're dealing with somebody, are you in negotiating and you have a business that you're trying to run, and in this country and stuff, by virtue of some of the cultural values and stuff, is your very business almost at odds with that? And or if you negotiate, you got to be careful about that. Are you negotiating something, or are we trying to do something that's actually at odds with the business, with their values? I'm sorry. So, personal standard of changing willingness. So, personal standard of changing willingness. So like on one hand, we have to accept that you're having completely inflexible standards of behavior, and will make us ineffective in negotiations in a global world, filled with different cultures. So that is very possible. And then you have, on another hand, that's the best way to put this. We need to maintain clear personal standards that remain constant across different situations, both for our own moral state and also because of our reputation and managing perceptions and integrity and honesty, of our company. Notion of right and wrong. The notion of right and wrong. The notion of right and wrong can't be ambiguous, but again, the notion of right and wrong is going to be defined primarily by where are you, who are you talking to, and what is the culture and the mindset. Deciding the personal ethical line. You got to decide the personal ethical line which you won't cross. When you're going through negotiations, everyone always say there's a line that I will not cross. You got to know what that line is, and realistically, you got to know what that line is, or have some ideas of what it might be before you go into negotiations. That concludes this chapter.